Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to my talk at this year's International Dust Conference. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there with you in person, but I'm very happy for the opportunity to be able to deliver my presentation to you all virtually from Canada. So today I'm going to be discussing some of my PhD research that focuses on the photochemical uptake of ozone by organic coated titanium dioxide particles and the implication of these organic coatings on mineral dust photochemistry. So, as I'm sure most of us already know, there's over 1 billion tons of mineral dust emitted into the atmosphere each year, with one of the greatest sources for this dust being the Sahara Desert in northern Africa. And so what I'm showing here is just a NASA simulation of a Saharan dust event that took place in June of 2020, where we see dust being transported off the west coast of Africa, and within 10 days, this dust makes its way past the Atlantic, where it's deposited in North and Central and South America. And to give you an idea of what this kind of looks like for people living in these regions that experience high dust loadings, I'm showing this picture here that was taken in San Juan in Puerto Rico on June 22nd of that year, where we see a person looking out at the horizon that's completely obstructed by dust aerosol. And if we fast forward a day later, this was taken in Quintana Roo in Mexico on June 23rd. And again, here we see a city in this region that is blanketed by a layer of Saharan dust. And so why do we care about this dust? Well, it has a lot of different atmospheric implications, but what my research focuses on in particular is the ability of this dust to serve as a reactive surface in the atmosphere for the uptake and degradation of pollutant gases. And so what I'm showing here is a Saharan dust event in Dakar in Senegal. And if we were to zoom in onto an individual mineral dust particle in the atmosphere in this photo, we may expect to see all these reactions taking place. So for example, laboratory studies have shown both the uptake of organic and inorganic pollutants is possible at the surface of dust, and in many cases this leads to the formation of new species formed at the surface, as well as new species formed in the gas phase. And interestingly, a lot of this chemistry is enhanced in the presence of light, which means that dust itself is also photoactive. And so what my early PhD work focused on was trying to understand this photoreactivity. And how I did that is I looked at individual naturally sourced minerals and I investigated their reactivity with ozone, which I used as a model pollutant. And so I'm just showing a subset of these minerals. These are just 4 of them. And underneath each mineral is their reaction profile with ozone. So these were studied in a coated wall flow tube. So these minerals were ground up into a powder. And shown in these figures here is ozone on the y-axis and time on the x. And the blue and yellow regions represent the reactivity of the mineral with ozone in the dark and in the light, respectively. So what we can see right off the bat is that each mineral has a unique reaction profile with ozone, but interestingly, we find that the same mineral phase, so for example, I had sourced 2 titanites from 2 different locations, is also unique. So, for example, with one titanite, I saw a significant loss of ozone in the light versus the other titanite sample, I did not see very much loss of ozone in the light. So this sample was significantly less photoactive than the other sample. And this was a good first step in trying to untangle the complexities behind mineral dust photochemistry. But as I previously mentioned, these experiments were conducted in a coated wall flow tube. And as a result, these minerals were ground into a powder and their surfaces for uptake were quite fresh. And we know that that's not the case in the real atmosphere. So for example, I'm just showing here a dust episode in Beijing, China. And if we were to zoom in onto an individual mineral dust particle, but this time look at its chemical composition, we may expect to see something like this. So this is a single particle mass spectra of an individual mineral dust particle sampled. I believe this was somewhere in the United States, but regardless, what we can see is that this mass spectra contains ions that are not related to the minerals that are present in mineral dust. So for example, we see lots of carbon and chloride, nitrates and sulfates. And what this means essentially is that mineral dust is often found internally mixed with other various pollutants. And again, a lot of the time this could be as a result of its reaction with pollutant gases during its residence time in the atmosphere. And this has also been shown in other studies as well. So I'm just showing a scanning electron microscopy image of an individual dust particle where we notice a particle morphology that has an outer shell and an inner shell. And when the authors investigated the chemical composition of the outer and inner shells, what they found was this was a dust particle that was coated with organics. And so that's what my research tries to address. It tries to address how do these organic coatings influence the inherent photochemistry of mineral dust? Does it suppress or enhance pollutant uptake? And also, how does the dust photochemistry change if we increase the thickness of these coatings at the dust surface? And how I aim to do that is using an aerosol flow tube reactor. This is something I had designed early on in my PhD. And so the particles that I'm using in this aerosol flow tube reactor is titanium dioxide. This is just a simple model for mineral dust. And the organic coatings that I'm using is icosane and decyl cyclohexane. Both of these have been detected in diesel exhaust, so they have some atmospheric relevance to them. And I'm just showing here a schematic of the aerosol flow tube setup, which I will quickly walk you guys through. So at the bottom here is a nebulizer, which generates titanium dioxide aerosol that's then passed through a diffusion dryer to remove any water. And then titanium dioxide particles move into a coating apparatus that either contains icosane or decyl cyclohexane. This coating apparatus is heated to allow these organics to vaporize, and then it's cooled to allow for the condensation of these organics onto the surface of the particles. And depending on the temperature of this, as we increase the temperature, we are also increasing the coating thickness on the particles. And then these coated particles are then injected into the side of the aerosol flow tube. And then here at the top, we have a movable injector that introduces ozone. So depending on if it's pushed all the way down or pulled all the way out, we can control for the exposure of ozone towards titanium dioxide particles. And again, since we are studying the photochemical uptake of ozone, this aerosol flow tube is surrounded by 8 UVA lamps to capture a small region of the solar spectrum. And then at the bottom here, we have a scanning electrical mobility spectrometer to obtain the particle size distribution, as well as the surface area of the titanium dioxide particles, as well as an ozone analyzer to measure the ozone concentration over time. And if you're not a huge fan of schematics, I've also attached here just an actual photo of the flow tube setup. And what we can do with this setup is calculate an uptake coefficient, which is denoted by gamma here. And this represents the total amount of ozone taken up onto the surface divided by the total number of collisions that ozone has with the surface. And how we can calculate that is by obtaining a pseudo first order rate constant. This is determined by by using ozone concentrations in the presence and in the absence of titanium dioxide, as well as the mean molecular speed of ozone and the total number of dust particles and their surface area as well. So one important thing for these experiments was to optimize our dust generation technique with the nebulizer, and it's really important that the dust concentration stays the same throughout the experiment for us to be able to calculate these gammas appropriately. So at the beginning of the experiment, I noticed some strange things happening. So here I'm showing the total area on the left-hand side with the total number on the right, and then again, this is a function of time. And what we can see in this plot, where the blue regions represent time points in the dark and the yellow is time points in the light, is that anytime I turned on the light in the experiments, both the total area and the total number of particles would increase. And this was strange. At first, I wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but the more I looked into it, it seemed like it was an effect of photophoresis. And so during illumination, essentially, you are heating up parts of the flow tube, even though there is a water jacket that is there to control for temperature. This still did not prevent heating up sides of the flow tube that would result in dislodging titanium dioxide particles that were absorbed onto the wall and making these particles migrate towards the center and then get sampled out. So in order to try to reduce these photophoresis effects, to try to stabilize the total area and total number of particles over the time of the experiments, I played around with the temperature of the system, and by reducing the temperature, I was able to stabilize the number of particles getting generated, and I'm showing that here. So here I'm showing particle diameter as a function of time, and then the color legend here represents the number of particles per centimeter cubed. And what we can see is overall these are now constant when the temperature is reduced into the reduced in the flow tube. And again, we also see a bimodal particle size distribution at around 700 and 1500 nanometers. So these are the size of the particles that are getting generated by the nebulizer. And so what we can do with this information now is look at the ozone uptake by organic coated titanium dioxide. So first off, I'm just showing an uncoated titanium dioxide particles here, where I'm showing ozone on the y-axis and time on the bottom. Again, blue and yellow represent regions in the dark and the light, and then these are with increasing temperature. And what we can see is that as temperature increases, the loss of ozone generally stays the same. But with the decyl-cyclohexane, we see that as temperature increases, the ozone loss decreases up until 75 degrees, where we see pretty much no loss of ozone at the surface. So this ultimately means that organic coatings are able to suppress the photochemical uptake of ozone by titanium dioxide. And what we can do with all this data is then go back and calculate those uptake coefficients, as I previously mentioned. And when we do this, we get data that looks like so. So I'm showing the uptake coefficient here as a function of, versus temperature. And I'm showing uncoated icosane and decyl-cyclohexane coated titanium dioxide particles. And what we can see is that as we increase the temperature, the uptake of ozone decreases. And in particular, it decreases the most with the decyl-cyclohexane coating compared to the icosane. And one reason for this could be because decyl-cyclohexane has a vapor pressure that's twice as high as icosane. So we may just be able to generate more of the decyl-cyclohexane in the gas phase when we're heating it, which ultimately leads to greater condensation onto the surface of the particles and thicker coatings. So the next steps for this project is to investigate the influence of shorter coatings, including N-heptadecane, to see when does this photochemistry become suppressed, at what time at what viscosity is ozone limited to reaching the photoactive titanium dioxide surface. As well, we also want to try to obtain coating thicknesses using our scanning electrical mobility spectrometer by looking at changes in size distribution during the coating process to try to approximate coating thickness. And so, in summary, we were able to kind of answer some of these questions in this talk. Again, this work is still a little preliminary, but what we do know is that organic coatings can in fact suppress mineral dust photochemistry, and that the suppression is greater with thicker coatings. So this means that with organic coatings, ozone is unable to diffuse through the coatings to reach the photoactive surface. And this may have some implications for mineral dust photochemistry, again, as these coatings are observed on ambient dust aerosol. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.